In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
The gospel text from today is one that we can consider is to be something of a fox and henhouse tale. And there are reasons that this is appropriate and timely for this weekend. Timely because it is the season of Lent, a time when we as individuals and as the church do our bit of self-reflection, prayer, spiritual reading, and penitence, repentance of turning around from who we are and to recognize what our role in the world to be is. Jesus' lament here is brought on by a warning from the Pharisees. In some ways, it seems to me that we are conditioned to think negatively about the Pharisees. How many of you, as soon as you hear the word Pharisees, kind of get your hackles up a little bit, especially when it comes to Jesus? That is particularly true of Matthew's view of the Pharisees. He is very anti-Pharisee. Jesus, as you'll notice if you look through Luke's gospel, he spends a lot of time hanging out with the Pharisees. And he's not hanging out with them just to diss on them. He's hanging out with them because he understands that there is hope for them, and they're seeking to know God is genuine, but it is tainted. It's tainted by the necessities of compromise. And the necessities of compromise that come to the Pharisees have come partly through Herod and partly through the Roman occupation. It is difficult to remain consistent with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to be aligned with the halls of power. That is a simple fact. Whenever the way of powerlessness comes up against the way of power, something has got to give. And the way of powerlessness has always been a hallmark of this tradition, this monotheistic tradition that Abram hears in Genesis and says, stick with me, trust me on this, Abram. Eleazar of Damascus is not the best that we can do together, but you're going to have to trust me. You're going to have to trust my timing. You're going to have to trust fits and starts in our journey together. But if we can stay faithful, more than you can imagine will become part of your domain and dominion. Jesus says the same thing for the church. He says that I will help you make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and I will be with you always, even to the end of the ages. And sometimes we in the church fail to act as though we believe what he says. And we're not alone. The disciples had the same problem. They started complaining, as Archbishop Brunsey of Canterbury said, they started majoring in minor issues pretty quickly. They started, is it circumcision, is it not circumcision? Our House of Bishops is meeting in North Carolina. They'll wind up this weekend, meeting at Canoga Conference Center, and they're working through what Presiding Bishop Curry has invited the church into doing a journey through Lent using the way of love. And that the way of love is the hallmark of what it means to be a Christian. Beginning even before he preached his famous royal wedding sermon, Bishop Curry has been all about love. He has been all about freedom. He has been all about taking the long view. I think if you were to look at a characteristic of Bishop Curry, he would match up very well with a quotation of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And as I was reading one of my commentaries this week, the homiletical commentary about this text that we're dealing with in the gospel, I was saying, man, this imagery is really familiar. It's talking about the freeing of the slaves, about the strength of the spiritual tradition, the Negro spiritual and their tradition, to tell the stories of what it means to hope for something that seems impossible, to live as free men and women in this country. We are in the midst of a celebration. I don't know if you could call that a commemoration, is probably a better term. A commemoration here in Hampton. 1619, 400 years ago, the first African Americans were brought to these shores against their will. And the institution of slavery took hold in this country. And we would love to say that we have overcome that and that we will overcome it all in due course, but it took a bloody long time for it to happen, even in small measures. From 1619 to 1861, 3? I'm not so good at math. I know that it's more than 200 years. About as long as we have been a nation. And to say that we're even close to being over it is to tell ourselves one of the colossal lies of the century. And unfortunately, what we struggle with is not isolated to us as Americans. You don't have to look very far to see what happens when an us versus them mentality takes hold across the world. We're seeing it across the world, across religions, across boundaries. And perhaps most surprisingly to me, we saw it erupt this week in New Zealand, of all places. And in what city?
Christchurch.
How ironic. That in Christchurch, New Zealand, someone who cited, at least to a certain degree, a level of intolerance not found in this country in a long time as his model, set off and brutally murdered 49 people because of how they worship the one God that we all claim. This has got to grieve the heart of every one of us. And it's got to do more than just grieve our hearts. We have to be more than sad and outraged. And there's a time that we have to stand up and we have to be counted, and that nothing of consequence is accomplished by laxness. We need to stand up and be counted, to speak the truth. As we listen to the Pharisees that have come to Jesus today saying, Herod's out to kill you, Jesus is uncharacteristically full of attitude. And I love it, right? What does he say? Go tell that fox for me that I have work to do. And there are those, perhaps even sitting here in front of me now, that will say, look, this is not the work of the church. Talk about something else besides the scourge of gun violence, the scourge of tribalism, fundamentalism, hatred, discrimination. If we can't talk about that, we might as well just stop.
Amen.
If we have nothing to say in light of such things, then we have failed in the Great Commission. We have probably taken the path of the great omission instead.
Amen.
We need to be continually involved in the world but not co-opted by it. Now, why does Jesus tell that fox that I have work to do? You go back to chapter 9 in Luke's Gospel. Do you remember this part? You see it a little bit in Jesus Christ Superstar. What does this Herod, want from Jesus?
His adoration.
He wants that, but he also sees an opportunity. Jesus has been doing these miracles, and Herod is not unaware of what goes on in his country. Remember, Herod's place is up in Galilee, Jesus' hometown. He's heard the stories for a good long while. Jesus has not been to Jerusalem yet. And this is Herod the Great's son, whose half-brother he had killed so he could marry his wife. And that's what caused John the Baptist to lose his head like he did. Herod Antipas has got, as we might say, issues. But he is politically savvy. He knows that his role of tetrarch, a ruler over a quarter of the Roman colony that is established in Palestine, is dependent upon his ability to work the middle. To work the middle between the religious leaders on one end and the Roman occupiers on the other. And he's looking for any advantage he can find. In Jesus Christ Superstar, what does Herod invite Jesus to do? Walk across my swimming pool, right? He is interested in the show. And you'll see sometimes the depictions of this particular Herod as one that is flamboyant. I saw one production that had him wearing purple Crocs and, I guess that's all you need to know, is that he's wearing purple Crocs. But as a politically savvy operator, this Herod knows that to have something flashy on his side is going to be helpful. And he's trying to recruit Jesus. Come and visit Jesus. We can help one another out. And Jesus refuses to be co-opted. And so the church needs to refuse to be co-opted. Something has happened in this country in the last generation or two where portions of our Christian brothers and sisters have become very enamored of being allied with the halls of power. And we as Episcopalians have no room to throw any stones here. What religion, what denomination have more American presidents been than any other? Episcopalian. And we're not even talking just because of the colonials, right? George Bush, the first, Gerald Ford. In recent memory, we have a history from both sides of the aisle. As Garrison Keillor, who we know has been discredited now, but still has had some interesting things to say, says, growing up Lutheran, I always thought the Episcopalians were Christians who worshiped God in extremely good taste. They were the church of brown wingtips and scotch and soda, and in some parts of the country there still is a sherry cart after Eucharist. But he goes on to say in this essay called Being Episcopalian, he says, the church I encountered when I moved to New York, this is Keillor talking again, was a church that worships with all sorts and conditions. He's talking about the Church of the Holy Apostles in New York City, where since the inception of their soup kitchen in the 1980s has served over 1 million meals to the poor and housing insecure of New York City. And he says it is a place where gay and straight, black and white, mink and dirt can worship together and say the prayers of the people, have mercy, dear Lord. I don't know what the answer is to the scourge of this kind of hateful violence that has afflicted nations across the world now, across religions, but I do know what the answer is not. More and more of what does not work is not going to fix this problem. It is not more guns that will solve this problem. We live in a commonwealth where in the last legislative session there was seriously debated a bit of legislation that would allow guns in worship. If there is any place where we should be talking about beating plows or swords into plowshares, or guns into rakes, it ought to be in this space. We can no longer endorse or even allow permanent solutions to temporary problems. That somehow we have to learn how to have these difficult conversations. And we're not going to fix the big problems until we can learn to have the smaller problems together. And that's why I believe that this congregation has something very important to contribute to the life of the church in a broader sense. Look around you. Look around you at who you worship with. Look around you, not you. You pay attention to me. This isn't the melting pot. This is a glorious fruit salad of God's flavors. And we have not just a chance, but an obligation to speak up, to speak out, to be heard, and to show, perhaps most importantly, the world what is possible when we declare simply that Jesus is Lord and our tribe is not. So may we continue in this Lenten season to go forward in faith, to pray twice as much as we speak, but to speak out when it's necessary. And it is for times like this that the church has come, and that the way of love demands that we not look the other way, but to speak the truth, and to speak the truth to those who need to hear it most, to both the victims and the offenders, praying for them in the equal measure to turn their hearts to the one true God that counts his children as numerous as the stars in the desert sky. May we continue in this way of love and show the world just exactly what is possible. In Jesus' name.